This research examines how an approach of multiple partial agreements rather than comprehensive deals may sometimes be the better choice in efforts to resolve deep-rooted conflicts. So for the next 30 minutes, we're going to be exploring the key findings and conclusions of this research. The central goal of any negotiation between conflicting parties is to reach an agreement that resolves the conflict. As such, it would seem logical to pursue a comprehensive deal or a comprehensive political settlement, which encompasses most, if not all, of the major issues in a dispute. Alejandro, can you please explain why the default to a comprehensive deal can sometimes be counterproductive? Please also explain what we actually mean by partial agreements, and within the context of IFIT's work, maybe inform our audience why you chose to examine this subject.
Thank you very much, Colleen, for the introduction and for the opportunity to present the work we are doing on partial agreements. I mean, as most of the work that we do here at IFIT, this approach and actually this whole research we are doing on partial agreements originates from the work we are leading in Venezuela and Zimbabwe in collaboration with our Brain Trust members there, among other countries, and from the need that exists in such contexts to really think outside the box and develop creative and realistic ideas that can help our colleagues there overcome the political, social, and economic crises their countries are facing. This subject we are examining today in this webinar and overall in general at IFIT, therefore comes from a very practical need in the countries where we work. In the paper we circulated and I've co-authored with Andres, we defined partial agreements as limited focus deals reached on limited focus issues as part of a limited focus negotiation agenda. They are partial in the sense that they are limited in scope. They do not aim to resolve the totality of issues in dispute between conflict parties, and because they are reached between a limited set of actors. They are not comprehensive because they do not aim to resolve all the issues all the actors may have in one negotiation. These types of agreements may be reached through any combination of 1.5 or 2-track processes or within any of those tracks. For example, partial agreements may include deals between 2 or more state actors, between a state and multiple civic actors, as well as between 2 or more civil society groupings. Another key aspect of partial agreements is that they tend to have a higher transformation potential when each agreement not only brings its own direct benefit, but also has the secondary benefit of improving the prospect of new partial agreements on other issues of dispute. That is to say that partial agreements produce most benefits when they are pursued as part of a larger strategic vision, where one agreement leads to more trust between the parties and to other agreements in key areas. There are 2 main reasons why the default to a comprehensive settlement in the context of entrenched armed or political conflict can sometimes be counterproductive. Firstly, I would say that rarely are the local, regional, and global conditions conducive for achieving a comprehensive settlement. And when they are, and an agreement is actually signed, the implementation challenges of such agreements may prove insurmountable, both logistically and also financially, but also because usually in the countries where we work, institutions tend to also be quite weak. In many contexts, there are simply too many factors and at times too many actors and too many issues to address to assume that they can all be resolved in one all-encompassing settlement. Secondly, the pursuit of a comprehensive settlement may be counterproductive because it may also have the negative effect of obscuring more incremental pathways to achieve substantially the same result. A comprehensive settlement or political settlement is not a necessary precondition for the construction of a school or a hospital or the delivery of humanitarian aid. So although it may seem more logical and more obvious to resolve all issues in dispute in one go, this is not the case in all contexts. And the idea of dividing the resolution of the crisis into digestible chunks may actually be a better approach in many of the countries where we work.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you for that. So let me turn to you, Andres. So following on this overview that Alejandro has provided, Can you now explain more about the specific context in which partial agreements can be useful in resolving wars or political conflicts? Also, maybe if you can speak a bit more about the specific benefits that partial agreements may bring, and also refer maybe to some real life examples if you can.
Thanks, Colleen. Welcome, everyone. I think I'm going to draw on what Alejo was saying, and I think that the first thing that it's relevant to have in mind is the context-specific analysis decision makers have to do on which path to take. These are reflections and recommendations that are context sensitive. So you have to see what type of conflict, what type of situation there is in order to decide if partial agreements are a useful, are beneficial, are a conducive approach to solving an intractable conflict. So that's the first thing. Especially, you have to have in mind in the design of the whole process this idea that partial agreements could lead eventually to a comprehensive settlement in an incremental way. So sometimes it's not one thing or the other, but the how you approach it, how you start. So in that regard, that's why we've been saying that it's important also to consider this approach, as we think there's at least 6 benefits, and we've seen it in practice in various contexts where it has worked. A first benefit, I would say, is that trying partial agreements serves to overcome one of the most significant obstacles when starting a negotiation, and is the lack of trust between the parties in conflict. So when you develop a partial agreements approach, you start developing incrementally small cooperative results. So as long as you start producing early results in the negotiation that serve to both parties to see that they're actually achieving something together, that serves to empower those moderate factions within each of the parties that are in favor of the negotiation, empower them vis-a-vis the other factions that, as it always happens, are not probably interested in making progress in an agreement. So it's important in the sense that it empowers moderates and it produces early results in a trust-building logic that overcomes the sum-zero game and produces a cooperation logic. The second benefit that Alejandro was already mentioning has to do with trying to divide a very big problem, a very big structural conditions, grievances, etc., into digestible chunks. So this is based on game theory, on negotiation theory, that sometimes trying to approach a very comprehensive agenda may take a lot of time and may be very difficult, and especially if there's suffering, if there's humanitarian suffering, if there's a lot of violence. So trying to separate different items of the problem into specific issues that could be manageable, that I'll talk about them later, could be useful to try to produce, as I just said before, credible outcomes that show both the parties and the external public that the negotiation could be a useful way to solve the problem, because timing and spoilers are always something to consider. A third benefit is what we've called in the paper positive disruption and empowerment of local actors. And what we mean by that is that this type of approach may help to open up different tracks in which civic actors, various political and social actors interested in peacemaking could also join forces and also help through various tracks to create a favorable environment and create different kinds of agreements on different issues, social, economic, institutional issues that could accumulate and create incrementally a better environment than before, and that only focusing on a very specific formal talk. And I'll just mention quickly the other one so that we can move on. Creating a common framework for future agreements that Alejo was already mentioning it before. Rekindling regional and international engagement. Sometimes diplomatic fatigue may distance international actors from support to a specific context. So, for example, what we've seen in Venezuela is that there's a lot of diplomatic fatigue from some years ago up until now, and this approach that has emerged since a year ago of trying to develop a partial agreement has rekindled the interest of the international community in supporting the solution. And of course, starting to implement actions may also address local humanitarian problems without having to wait until you finalize the negotiations. So these are just some ideas, but again, as I said in the start of the intervention, it's always very context specific.
Thank you for that, Andres. I mean, clearly from what you have just shared, there are clear advantages to seeking partial agreements, but we are also aware that they are not a panacea for resolving deep conflicts. Alejandro, can you please outline some of the risks associated with such agreements and what can be done to mitigate the risks?
Yes, Colleen, thank you. Partial agreements are definitely not a panacea for resolving conflict, and we know that, and we know that they come with risks and dilemmas, and that those risks and dilemmas tend to be greater for the side with the lower bargaining power. It is therefore very important to have a very clear understanding of what these risks and dilemmas are if one is to have any serious kind of discussion about the utility of this approach in any given context. A frequent argument against partial agreement, and probably the most obvious one, is that they may serve to legitimize or empower the stronger party by enhancing its political image. And this is because isolated agreements, that is to say, agreements that do not build on each other and not part of a broader strategic framework, do not resolve the underlying crisis, but only alleviate its effect. So this reduces rather than increases the incentives for further conflict resolution efforts and limits the transformational nature of the partial agreements approach that we are proposing. The risk, however, may be mitigated by ensuring that the agreements being promoted are part of a larger strategic vision, and I referred to that before, and Andres also mentioned that, but also by developing explicit language that frames the agreement as part of a broader peace-building process aimed at addressing the conflict as a whole, rather than making that agreement a whole, just make it a part of some larger whole. A second important risk is that of spoilers, which are always a risk in any negotiation, but may even be more so in the context of partial agreements. And this is because there are multiple negotiations happening at the same time between multiple different actors, which makes it practically impossible to control all aspects of each process. Strategic planning is therefore key to ensuring that potential spoilers are handled with care and do not derail the dialogue efforts. I would say that the most important mitigation action in this regard is the development of preemptive strategies of neutralization and addressing the media in ways that take account of important narratives on which the spoiler's political agenda depends. It is important to be prepared for spoilers. There will happen, but it's even more important to address them in a way that does not further derail the dialogue process. A second preemptive strategy is to sequence the negotiation topics in a way that mitigates against early and easy attacks. That is to say, when developing a plan for a partial agreements process, it may be smarter to begin by negotiating less contentious issues and build up towards more contentious ones once more trust has been built among the parties. Another important risk taken into consideration is that partial agreements will naturally lead to the opening of simultaneous dialogue spaces on multiple fronts between multiple different actors. And if they are not managed strategically, they may culminate in isolated partial agreements that may lead to some of the risks I am outlining now. This risk can be partially mitigated by situating any effort toward a partial agreement within that larger strategic framework that we have referred to multiple times, and by establishing need-to-know information, protocols, or mechanisms among key allies in the different spaces that have been created. Lastly, a key challenge with partial agreements is verification and certification. Comprehensive settlements tend to include certification or verification schemes designed to ensure the parties comply with their obligations. In the context of partial agreements approach, where different deals may be reached between different actors at different times, certification can present additional challenges, such as finding willing guarantors or devising systems to manage implementation across different processes. This risk, again, can only be mitigated when there is a larger strategic framework of conflict resolution in place, such that the supporters, the monitors, and the guarantors of the implementation clearly understand their role and place within the partial agreements format. So in summary, the four main risks associated with partial agreements include the risk of entrenching the stronger party if the partial agreements approach culminates in isolated agreements, the issue of spoilers, fragmentation efforts when too many spaces are opened at the same time and there is no coordination, and the issue of verification mechanism. And the key mitigation strategies, I would say, are the partial agreements must be situated within that larger strategic negotiating framework. There is a need to develop preemptive strategies to prevent spoilers and ensure that partial agreements are not regarded as isolated agreements. There needs to be a good coordination across different groups and different spaces to prevent fragmentation. And external actors must really understand their role and place within the partial agreements format and clearly see that the agreements are part of that broader vision.
Interesting. Thank you for that outline, Alejandro. So now we have an understanding of the potential advantages and risks of partial agreements. And I'm now just asking myself and thinking about the how. Can you please speak a bit about the potential areas, structures, or even approaches through which conflicting parties can work towards partial agreements? And also, are there maybe any recent examples that we can refer to when we're thinking about this question on the how? Andres, maybe you can respond to that.
Great, Colleen, thanks. These are very difficult and complex issues and dilemmas, especially when there are contexts of very, as Alejandro was saying, very high asymmetries of power in a negotiation. For example, when we're talking about authoritarian contexts in which there's a coalition in power that is dealing with an opposition. That is the case, for example, in Venezuela right now. And it's very difficult always the decision and the strategizing of how to move forward. But I think that's a reason. There's a recent example in Venezuela in the negotiations that are currently underway, facilitated by Norway, that they have a memorandum of understanding with a comprehensive agenda, but that has adopted the partial agreements pathway. So it's kind of a combination, and it's interesting because they haven't waited to have all the agreements reached to start the implementation. And there was a recent agreement. The current negotiations are stalled, but the last agreement was reached in November it was a humanitarian agreement. It was the creation of a social fund for the Venezuelan people, and that is interesting because it gives you a concrete example of how this type of approach may actually help to start solving very acute and deep problems of human suffering. In the case of Venezuela, very big nutrition and health and energy problems. And you can see that elsewhere where humanitarian issues actually, they usually are not part of the political track. They should be like a side issue, of course, because these are humanitarian issues, but this agreement also helps and provides further opportunities to reach other issues on more political and economic issues that are more sensible. But there are other examples as well we could talk about. There's a bunch of examples in which economic and social measures are relevant because they provide an excuse for both parties that are in conflict to create a common ground to solve common needs of the population. So infrastructure development, public services development, local reconstruction and recovery, resource management. There's a lot of things that could be dealt with in terms of social and economic problems that could involve third actors, whether that is local civil society, whether that is the international community, and provide a buy-in for other actors to support the negotiations further on the road when they reach the more difficult areas. Of course, there's also institutional reforms, issues about elections that have also happened in other cases, issues, items related to accountability, standards on transparency, these kind of things that could be also dealt with in a partial agreements approach. And with a lot of caution, there's some context in which ceasefires could also be part of a partial agreement. But as I said before, it has to do with the type of negotiation and context you're dealing with.
Thank you, Andres, for those very specific examples. Before we close, Alejandro, is there anything else that you would like to add, particularly in terms of any further work that IFIT intends to undertake on this subject? And also maybe if you can provide some insights into how the practical implementation of partial agreements can be encouraged.
Thank you, Colleen. I mean, as I mentioned in my first intervention, the work IFIT is leading on partial agreements originates from that very practical need we have to develop ideas to help our colleagues, ideas and approaches to help our colleagues in Zimbabwe and Venezuela and multiple other countries overcome the crises their countries are facing. In that sense, our immediate work in the future, what actually ongoing, is to continue to promote discussions on the partial agreements approach and how this approach may build peace in many of the countries where we work, including Venezuela, where we are not only promoting the partial agreements approach, but we are helping design the ongoing dialogue taking place in Mexico. And I'll allow Andres to speak a bit about that there. Lastly, I would say that this discussion paper may become the foundation for future IFIT research on the subject, including the possibility of identifying and studying successful and unsuccessful cases where the partial agreement was utilized to provide more comprehensive and evidence-informed guidance on the specific approach that we are currently promoting. So now let me give it back to Andres so we can speak a little bit about the plans they have in terms of partial agreements, specifically in the context of Venezuela.
Thanks, Alejandro. Just for these last couple of minutes, I would just say that our effort in IFIT is trying to provide decision makers in the countries where we work the methodological frameworks and resources so that they can become conscious of the type of decisions they're making and open them up, and always making them aware of the different options and the spectrum of possibilities there are, so that the strategizing on how to move forward with the process design issues is as rigorous and realistic as possible for the context they're facing. In the case of Venezuela, we continue to work with the different actors, trying to kind of come up with a partial agreements approach that is a win-win scenario, a cooperation scenario for all the actors involved, especially the government and the opposition, but that comes up with an agreement that is beneficial for the Venezuelan population, like the November agreement on the social fund, and that combines economic measures with institutional measures that come up with a roadmap for the country's reinstitutionalization and democratization, but in a gradual, inclusive, and sustainable way. So I think that's trying to find that kind of stairway in which you continue to contribute in every step towards that common goal. It's key, not coming up with a type of transactional logic that corners one part or the other into a position that is not comfortable and that they will eventually reject. So that is one of the main objectives of this partial agreement logic, to try to build trust and come up with a negotiation space that is based on cooperation.
Thank you so much for that, Andres, and many thanks to both of you for sharing these really fascinating insights. And thank you all who joined us for today's discussion. We do look forward to seeing you at future events within our 10 Peacebuilding Innovations series. We definitely will be sharing more information and invitations on our next webinar, so please do look out for that. Keep well, and thank you once again for joining us.